And good afternoon. It's very good to be back here, and I have to tell you, as I was cruising down the A696 and just coming round the corner at Little Hull, there was this huge, beautiful, bright rainbow. It was complete, and it was completely over Kirk Welpington, so I thought, yes. Why did I ever leave? So I've called the talk Rural Church Sustaining Strength, and it's intentionally ambiguous, talking about the rural church, both the building and the congregation. And in that same sense, the rural church is not a problem to be solved, but it's an asset. It's an asset that we enjoy now, and it's an asset that we can develop. That means it's not something static. It does change, and as the saints of the Reformation remind us, the church is semper reformanda. It is always to be reformed. Every church should be a permanent building site in that sense, because we are about God's kingdom, not about an ecclesiastical empire. I've been impressed with what I've heard this morning, thank you Yvonne and Claire, and what I've read about the project, and I've had sort of very good feedback also. People have said, oh, this has been really great, this project that we've done. So well done project leaders, and it's good to hear how this has flourished. And I think what you and what we are doing is in the ether. I'm going to start my talk in a way back to front. You know how at the end you usually talk about the resources that you recommend, but I'm going to start the other way around, and I've just realized I've forgotten something. Here it is. So I want to introduce 3 resources. The first one is How Village Churches Thrive. I think a lot of you will probably be familiar with that, yes? Vigorous head nodding. So you can see what I meant. It is in the ether. It's a fantastic compendium with really helpful practical advice. It dovetails with a lot of the checklist that Yvonne has talked with you a little bit earlier. It is well presented. I really commend it warmly. It talks about warm welcome, making the most of life events, using buildings creatively. And I want to tell you something, because we are so much about church buildings. The story of one of our new communities in the Diocese of Ely called North Stowe. Something that I had to learn where I live now in Cambridgeshire is the huge areas of new housing that are being developed. Not just, 20 houses, but 12,000 homes. Whole new towns being created. That, of course, is a separate challenge for us. But one of our pioneers who started a church there in a local Church of England school, they came together outside when the Queen died to mark that event. And people came along, there was quite a gathering, and one of the people said to her, who clearly had no particular church affiliation, said to her, "We need a church building here. Where do we go when these important events happen for the life of our community?" I thought, what a lovely insight given to us here about the importance of our buildings. And as I stepped into this church here, I remembered many, many important occasions, sad ones as well as happy ones, that we have celebrated here. So that's really the church building at the heart of the community, where we bring what is important to us. And we can use these buildings more creatively than just between 10 and 11 on a Sunday morning. Of course, there's also then a question of who takes control of what happens. in my rich and varied life now. In fact, two of our churches have burnt down since I've arrived. No connection, I hope. But in the latter ones, both rural churches in West Norfolk, part of our diocese, and in one of them, there's been a huge fallout between two sets of the community, PCC and the wider community. One section wanting to rebuild this very pretty church as a complete replica with the insurance money, and the other saying, well, obviously, we're not going to put a 1960s concrete horror here, but it looks very similar from the outside, but let's make it more usable for community. Big problem. So, using church buildings creatively. So lots of ideas in that book. Caring for God's acre, you've talked about churchyards, being the heartbeat of the community. Some of you might have heard of the PMC process that's, oh dear, now I can't remember I wonder whether Partnership for Missional Church, isn't it? Thank you. That has been, it's often used in an urban context, but it has also been used successfully in a rural context. It requires a lot of hard work. It's a 3-year program of really looking what is actually going on in our communities and looking beyond what we think, we know that. And even in a small rural community, there can often be things that we're not aware of, and that process helps you do that community audit and reflect on how to respond. Celebrating our heritage, cultivating fruitful festivals, welcoming more children, reaching the isolated and lonely. Yes, let's train people in listening while not stopping the milk of human kindness from flowing that's so often so evident in our rural communities. And communicating effectively. So, how village churches thrive. Faith sharing. I've just put a sort of pre-PowerPoint, just so you see the points that I'm going to talk of. I don't know how well you can read it from the back, but perhaps you can a bit. The building, in particular. We've got a program running in Ely Diocese that you can look up on the web called REACH Ely. Stands for Reimagining Churches as Community Assets for the Common Good. Doesn't that sound amazing? It's a project to help communities make fuller use of their historic churches. Doesn't that sound familiar? It's about an understanding of the relationship between communities and wider use of church buildings, as well as the contribution that churches make to the common good. And so one of the things we've looked at, or that the project, which is just coming to its fruition, we're having a meeting where the project is going to be presented, analogous to what we're doing here today, in a couple of weeks' time. So they're looking at festival churches, interviews with working festival churches, guidance on how to adopt that status, church friends groups, being an open church safely, being a green church, being a community church, welcoming new residents, welcoming church visitors. And I think a lot of that all this is in the ether, has something to do with a rediscovery of the local, not least during the pandemic, which those of us living in rural areas, especially remote rural areas, have known all along. And my third point is social action, community transformation. Maybe you've heard of the Cinnamon Network. It's a network that gives support and advice for grassroots projects that really make a difference. From mental health to refugee support, anything you can imagine, anything that will help a community be a better place for individuals and for groups. It's helping churches not to reinvent the wheel, and it's enabling good projects to be replicated. So that's the Cinnamon, just like the thing you have in your kitchen cupboard, the Cinnamon Network. Faith sharing, building, community transformation. And the key is not to think of those three in silos. And the rural church is in a prime position for this. So we come to today. Let me quote. In recent years, there's been a remarkable change in the make-up of the rural population. This has brought to villages a growing number of incomers, with higher proportions of the elderly and the more affluent among them. The overall picture leaves no doubt about the tensions between those who traditionally regarded the countryside as their own and their workplace, and the new arrivals. Interest in the countryside is by no means the preserve of those who live and work there. Urban dwellers, too, have claims and aspirations for the countryside they wish to enjoy. The integration of new villagers is a challenge for voluntary organisations and particularly for the church, among whose tasks is the reconciling of differences in the local community. That was written 1990. Faith in the Countryside, the report 33 years ago. And it describes change. We know our suburban and city contexts are constantly changing, but it seems to fill us with greater alarm when rural places change. Since 1990, while a number of the developments outlined in that quote have probably gathered pace, I'd suggest the following further points have had a marked impact on the rural context. There was foot and mouth disease, a real wake-up call. I mean, we were very much aware of it here in Northumberland. People realising something of the fragility and network of contemporary livestock farming. Churches intensified their efforts to have rural officers, such as me. The rural bishops' panel was invigorated, etc. And now, with increased financial pressures on dioceses, rural officers have been widely lost, or they're very marginal parts of someone's job description. Brexit. Having worked with the European Rural Development Programme as well as DEFRA, it had always seemed to me that Westminster had an exceptionally poor understanding of rural communities and agriculture. Trade deals, current and future, will have a major effect on farming in this country. And the frightening thing is that I am less confident that our lead politicians and civil servants in London have a full and proper grasp of what their decisions might mean, especially for remote rural areas and hill farming areas like we have here in Northumberland. The pandemic. Is it too early to specify what lasting change this may have brought about? Certainly, increased homeworking casts a new light on the relevance of the local, including the local church. People have moved into the countryside, and though I've also heard of the reverse of that trend, it has meant an even greater pricing out of the housing market of local people in less well-paid jobs. Claire referred to that earlier. Certainly, in many communities, the local church during the pandemic played a complete blinder in supporting individuals as well as proving to be a credible partner for local councils and similar organisations, similar agencies. On the negative side, a few people not returning to their small congregation can make already fragile churches really falter. And I'm sure there are some of you here who are well aware of that. The recent mission statistics of the Church of England, they're not yet in the public realm. I've had a chance to see them. They make for sobering reading across the board. If we believe we have a life-giving gospel entrusted to us for sharing, we really, what was it Claire said, need to get out there and be less shy about what treasure we have to offer. It doesn't just happen. And my final point is climate change. This is ever more, and finally, hopefully, those of us who are of the praying kind will be doing so, COP27, is it? permeating our thinking regarding church buildings, churchyards, logistics, and more widely, land use. There's been huge rumours around the changes at DEFRA. Is it going to be dismantled? Is there finally going to be a better understanding of rural communities? Nothing has been announced under the previous rather short-lived PM, just there were lots of meetings suddenly being cancelled at DEFRA. There's questions about whether the environmental land management scheme, which many farmers have been preparing for, will now maybe not happen after all, or maybe it will now again. So lots of speculation and much heat and rather less light generated about this. I think that we have a real problem because since public spending will have to be cut somewhere to pay for the tax cuts, farming will have the least electoral impact for our politicians. So there's a job for the rural church alongside the rural community in general support the farming community. I'm thinking of the farming community network, for instance. Being present at country shows, village shows, mart chaplaincy, building on local relationships with councils and other organisations, being salt and light, being constructively gritty and warmly visible. Working together is the key thing, and this conference, this whole project here, exemplifies beautifully what can be achieved when lots of different agencies come together and say, actually, together we are so much more than the sum of our parts. Working together with farming community, housing developers, infrastructure companies, official agencies, and so forth. And we have a key role in many of our rural and other ideas, linking rural and urban churches, making partnerships. So what about the strengths of the rural church and the difficulties as well? It's Dietrich Bonhoeffer who said, "The church stands not at the boundaries where human powers give out, but in the middle of the village." He wrote that in 1944. What he's doing here is, of course, not giving a geographical description of where the church is, but he's making a theological point against an awful God of the gaps theology, according to which Christian faith only comes into its own when it identifies a weakness in the community to exploit, but hasn't really got anything to offer to those who are well and strong. And we have a natural propensity to look for the chinks, for the problems. And of course we do that with the rural church too, seeing it as a problem we need to solve rather than a gift which can play a vital part in a village community. Not seeking to build alternative community, the Holy God Squad, but joining in as part of the beating heart of the village, the community, supporting, in the words of Philippians 4, supporting everything that is true, honourable, just, pure, pleasing, commendable, excellent, and worthy of praise. It's about focusing what we can do, not on what we can't. And the aforementioned how village churches thrive, the checklist that Yvonne presented, they are all tools to help you get there. I trust those of you who are here today have not signed up to that narrative of the rural church simply being a drain, a vampire church. We have a sense of the value of the rural church, which is closely bound up with the strengths of the rural community. And of course, we have a much larger percentage of engagement with the local population than many, many urban churches do. You will have heard it before. A satsuma is not a failed orange. Jim Collins from Stanford says, "A fox has lots of strategies to eat a hedgehog, but never succeeds because the hedgehog only has one strategy to stay alive. And it does that really, really well." So we need to know, as the rural church, what is our hedgehog strategy? What is the rural church really passionate about? What are we best at in the world? And what runs our economy? Well, the rural church is passionate about the village in which it lives. It's best at the world at loving God and loving their neighbour within that village. And the economic driver, it's keeping that church building open for the village. And that is what we need to work with. Local identity, offering that sense of belonging and a sense of commitment. Note the multi-hattedness of so many people in our rural communities. It's been shown how many voluntary services would collapse if church people pulled out. Build bridges across village organisations. Sometimes it's a bit of rivalry between the PCC and the Village Hall Committee and the Bowls Club or whatever it might be. Hold church events in other buildings, etc. It can be a lower threshold, and meeting in homes, in people's homes, can be a bit too suburban for some. Linked with that local identity is a streak of stubborn resilience, born out of that sense of belonging and commitment. That's such a strength. A small congregation means you can interact in worship differently than you can with 100 or 200 people. And the occasional offices. In a small rural church, you can be flexible. I remember when we had christenings here in Kirk Welpington. Well, we wanted to welcome people, and a communion service, which we'd normally have at that time on that Sunday, wouldn't have really worked for that family. So we just changed it round and to welcome the people who came. You can't be that flexible if you have a large church. The local school, especially if it is a Church of England school, that's something we often forget to think about when we think about the church. One of the things holding us back, again, is a sort of silo thinking. If not locally, then from a diocesan perspective. So we don't connect the dots, the children and the young people in the parish and in the schools. And while, of course, it's important to support the local church, the top priority has to be, how do we best reach and serve people, young people in this case? So churches need to realise that and accept that that might mean, with a happy conscience, sending the 3 young children in their church to a neighbouring church that can actually make something really fun with greater numbers. And how about honouring young people and inviting them onto their PCC? It's not just about drawing pictures. Getting them involved in shaping worship, leading on the churchyard eco project, and so forth. But there are difficulties. There's clericalism. The parish communion movement has to be named. It trained a whole generation, or 2 or 3 even, that they couldn't be satisfied with a non-Eucharistic service, with morning prayer, and thus professionalised worship. There's lay clergy collusion, making clergy run faster in the hamster wheel. Sometimes even clergy are blackmailed by congregations, insisting that they won't come if there isn't a Eucharist in their village. The financial model that we have developed really favours so often the larger church, which is the urban church. Most of our younger clergy have very little experience of the rural church. And we don't train nearly enough people in rural ministry and for rural ministry, and then we're surprised when we have a recruitment problem. And then there are all the other pressures that make church growth difficulty in general. So we need to be realistic as well. I'm probably not going to be very popular with this next idea, but there you go. I want to bring you an example from Lincoln Diocese, which has invited churches to classify themselves. That's a really important bit. It wasn't someone didn't go around and stick a label on churches, but invited church to classify yourselves. Are you a key mission church? Large, flourishing, confident, strategically located, serving a significant population, acting as a resource or hub maybe for a wider area? Or are you a local mission church, flourishing, confident, well-used, embedded in your village, adequately resourced in skills and lay involvement, with a clear sense of what you're about? Or are you a community church, keen to keep open with regular prayer and worship, with a good lay team to help deliver this, to serve as the focus for the community and for baptisms, weddings, funerals, for celebrations at key points in the year, and able to cover the cost of your stipendiary ministry? Or are you a festival church that wants to continue as a place of worship, but doesn't have the personnel, the resources, or the regular congregation to have the level of worship and prayer of a community church? Or are you a church exploring closure because you feel you can no longer sustain the responsibility of caring for a church building? And in some places, that it may well be that it's not too far from another church, and a potential repaired cost would be absolutely and totally prohibitive, where we do have to ask, how are we good stewards of the resources that we have? And if we put something in here, we will have less for there. Those are the realities. So what is our mission? One of the things that we've seen again and again in the last couple of weeks, or months even, is how people love to be part of something bigger, beyond themselves, beyond their little world. I'm thinking of the time of mourning for the Queen. The queues had religious character. It was a bit like a pilgrimage, wasn't it? And there was something worshipful about it. And perhaps small wonder that I've seen some tabloid papers speaking of calls to make the late Queen a saint. Perhaps an expression of a certain helplessness, coupled with the recognition that there is something intangibly religious going on here. To so many people, life can come across as absurd or meaningless. Our job is to enable people to find that God has already found them, that there is meaning and purpose. And that's what we celebrate in places such as this. I think as soon as we get trapped in the thought that we must keep rural churches going as an end in itself, then we've lost. And of course, I believe that the rural church has huge potential for visitors, where we use them as best we can, as a welcoming space, as visual aids for the Christian faith, and linking into tourism networks, linking into pilgrim pathways or long-distance walks. The rural church has a lot to offer for the local community, being part of something bigger than the local church. Teaching and learning this with mind and heart might also help those situations where a dutiful vicar is running him or herself into the ground because every hamlet insists on its own communion service every Sunday. Or for the community, assessing local needs, coordinating community support, initiating and partnering with others on social action projects. And in the last 20 years, we've been talking about fresh expressions of church, initially more in urban and suburban areas, but increasingly also stories from the rural. There's an important message that we don't need to be trapped in the way things have always been. And I'm not of the school that says we've tried that before, it doesn't work. But if it hasn't worked 73 times we've done it, maybe it's predictable what will happen when we try the 74th time. Fresh expressions are especially good at discerning and releasing the gifts and ministries of lay people who maybe find themselves a little more at the margins of traditional church life. They are also places where they can find new purpose in their Christian lives and make contributions in mission far beyond what they could have thought possible. Fresh expressions can also be especially damaging if they are not an authentic local expression, but an imported suburban model, maybe brought by people who've only just recently moved in and who know better straight away. So we now have messy church, muddy church, walking church, forest church, sweaty church, and all manner of outdoor church. And we can rejoice in that. And we just need to see, well, is there something that might actually work for us? And we'll customise it for us. I'm thinking of Garden Church in Norfolk, in rural lay-led missional communities, where they're making real something about the church needing to have a presence, yes, in the local church building, but also in people's homes, as well as being aware of the church worldwide, because that's the proper understanding of church according to the New Testament. We've said it before, the rural church is about the local, so you need a local team. As someone once said of rural ministry, bishops need to become more apostolic, clergy need to become more episcopal, and the laity need to become more priestly. Now we can critique that, but I think there are some important truths here. And there is one very important issue. Training clergy in a ministry of oversight or supervision, working with the training institutions locally to develop appropriate modules and courses. I think it's a real weakness across the Church of England that so few of us are really good at leading teams, supervising people in a way that encourages, with constructive feedback, giving a framework for development of the individual as well as of the ministry of the whole. It requires a bit of emotional intelligence. There are some who will get mad if you micromanage them. They just need a sort of rough outline. This is what I need to achieve, and you check in with them occasionally and let them get on with it, because you know you can trust them. There are others who are much more unsure, who require much more hand-holding. It's not about treating everyone equally, but adjusting. And there's always the difference whether you're working with people who are paid or people who are volunteers. It's not easy. And we somehow seem to assume that anyone of reasonable intelligence can work it out automatically as they go along, rather than requiring a framework and training. So if there's one important takeaway, I think one of the most valuable investments we can make to support the viability, the mission and ministry of our rural churches across the board is in thorough supervision training. And I'll be very happy if you tell me you're already doing this, in which case you'll agree with me. The other thing about local teams that's really important is valuing the local lay people who are there for the duration. They see clergy come and go. Some clergy are blockers. Some are enablers. Some lay people are blockers, and some are enablers. That's life. But too often it's easy to overlook current or potential lay leaders because they don't quite speak the right church jargon. Maybe they've gone off on their own, and as they've got impatient with the diocese not getting its act together. We've certainly seen that in Ely, in one of our deaneries. So it's important to just get over ourselves and engage with their work, even if it doesn't fit neatly into our categories, and listen and learn why it works there. And then, of course, there's also the licensed lay ministers, so often an untapped potential, while also the mainstay in many rural churches. And one of my bugbears, I'm responsible for licensed lay ministers in Ely Diocese. One of my bugbears is that this is not often enough honoured as a distinct calling. It's not a lesser calling because, they're not really ordained. It's just kind of foot soldier class. It's not officer class because it's the ordained clergy. No, it is a distinct calling and it needs to be honoured as such. And then, of course, there's also focal ministry. Are you doing anything about focal ministry in the diocese? Not thinking about it a bit? So I think every church, if we want to keep it open, want to keep it vital, needs someone locally who people can look to as the prime church contact. And the stipendiary clergy simply do not and will not have the capacity to be present in the way people might have been used to and would still like. Every village church, their own vicar. So we arrive at focal ministry, local leadership. It can be great, but it won't be if it's seen as a quick way to cut corners and stuff a hole, with no proper process in place for selection, proper working agreements, preparation of the congregation, and the aforementioned supervision. May be okay in some places, but you will for sure hit the buffers and end up with a right old mess with other people in other places. If you want to find out more, look at the website of Sheffield Diocese and Focal Ministry, Sheffield Diocese. Google that, you will find it. There's often a bit of suspicion. I'm coming to the end, don't worry. There's often a bit of suspicion in rural churches about the centre. I'm sure with Catherine here, you have a real advocate. Maybe geographically it's a fair bit away from diocesan HQ. Goodness knows what the diocesan office, ministry, mission staff do, for which we are paying our parish share. I firmly believe that both the diocesan staff and those on the ground need to understand that the diocese is there to resource the churches, and the project that is running here is a living example of that. So how about bringing the whole mission and ministry team to meet with each deanery to discuss together what the needs are, what resources are required, how you can help. It's the triaging for the black churches, coloured black in your graphs. You know, that's where the archdeacon comes in and can say, well, actually, we've got a resource here. We've got so-and-so who can come and help. This is about bottom-up, servant-led way of working, listening first, rather than a top-down approach where we talk first, unveil our marvellous strategy. Likewise, less suspicion at local level about the centre. And if you start a conversation early with diocesan officers about plans and resources, it'll help all round. And your new bishop designate, Helen Ann, comes with a great love for the rural church, though undoubtedly she will also have to make tough decisions as the bishop of the whole diocese. Finally, I want to end with a prayer. It's really important. Persistent, committed, personal and corporate prayer is the lifeblood of the church. When we teach on prayer and spirituality in church, we often focus on the individual, their need, their growth, their prayer life. But it mustn't be confined just to intercessions on Sunday. If the church is to develop, not for its own sake, but in order to make a bigger difference to the lives of those in our communities who we serve, we need a renewal of the church's prayer life, individually as well as corporately, and we will see how our gaze will be lifted outwards. Those who wish may pray with me. Lord, keep before us a vision of your love, the love that makes all things possible. Send us, Holy Spirit of God, to be and live to your glory, that Christ and his kingdom may be known in our rural churches and communities. Amen. Thank you.